The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Why do we love horror movies? What is behind the fascination that a multitude of us have with the darkness, with being afraid, and even willing to pay for it? We are going to dive into the reasons behind this with a hyper focus on our adoration of horror cinema in particular. First, let's define what makes a movie, well, horror. We love to castigate movies as not horror, barriers of entry, check boxes, and gatekeep. But horror isn't concerned with walls to genres. It actually seeks to obliterate them. And I will allow in that freedom my definition. I'm going to read an excerpt from an old textbook I ordered from Goodwill. What do we mean when we use the term horror film? An important part of the definition is self-evident. It is a movie that aims foremost to scare us. But the fear it evokes and how it goes about it are particular. While we are likely to experience anxiety and fright in other violent genres, a war story, disaster movie, or a crime drama, for instance, a horror film evokes deeper, more personal psychological fears in the starkest terms. The most basic fear in the horror story is the fear of death. But that is only the beginning of its impact and appeal. The fate of horror's most unfortunate characters usually comes down to two possibilities, which a given story may or may not consider synonymous. Death, the physical fact of the end of life, and damnation, a metaphysical conception that describes a state in which the immortal soul is condemned to eternal suffering and punishment. Creatures in horror stories, as well as their victims, often straddle these two domains in a horrible state that's neither death nor life. The threat of becoming one of the living dead or the undead, for example. The monster can be seen as a literal personification of death itself, which, like the traditional figure of the Grim Reaper, is an ultimately unstoppable opponent, relentlessly committed to the destruction of a healthy and vibrant human being. I could get off easy here and just say, look, fight or flight. I could say adrenaline, endorphins, oxytocin, the incredible feeling that follows their release. Because being afraid does elicit powerful emotions, hormones, for example, oxytocin. And they all work to retain these moments in our brain. A part of that is the people that we're with when we're watching and experiencing this. I think this explains why horror movies are best enjoyed with others. The same way the holiday Halloween is my favorite. I believe these environments further place this journey into fear into our memories on the tops of the mountains of the good times we have. For the singularly scientific or neurologically focused, this answer could be sufficient, but I want to dig deeper. I could say our love of horror movies, it's the manifestation of our fears on screen, especially with the heightened reality of facing subject matter that if we did so in real life, we'd be in grave danger. And this one we will explore a bit, as I believe its perplexities are fascinating, and I think it's a big source of where we will find the answer to our question. Love of horror is paradoxical, no doubt. The answer is going to be nuanced, but let's explore. And as always, I encourage you to study for yourself, dig deep in thought, sit with it, and what is it you get out of it? Comment down below, even before going forward, your answer to the question, if you dare to be so bold. I'm interested in your perspective that only you have. Let's pick up with a fundamental disagreement Aristotle and Plato had, with the horror master himself taking Aristotle's position on the matter. Mr. Stephen King. And I quote, "I like to see the most aggressive horror films as lifting a trap door in the civilized forebrain and throwing a basket of raw meat to the hungry alligators swimming around in that subterranean river beneath." Why bother? Because it keeps them from getting out, man. It keeps them down there and me up here. King has stated that once he was so mad at his kids, probably more than once, he had this fear within him that he caused him to ponder if he could truly hurt them. And because he felt so strong in his anger, out of this came Jack Torrance, and The Shining was born. In other words, Aristotle, in reference to art and sometimes the tragedy's portrayal within, he believes in the theory of catharsis, which is a Greek word for purification, and that it holds value in letting out these emotions and feelings deep within ourselves, and society is better for it. That the consumer of art would be purged of the desire to carry out any of the horrific acts themselves in the real world. Aristotle believed this, that regardless of the resolution of art, in other words, if it ended happy or not, didn't matter. That's points, honestly, for the reasoning, for this way of reasoning finding its way into the analysis of the horror film. Now, Plato disagreed. He said starve the gators, in different words. Plato distrusted the emotionally seductive powers of drama to the point he argued that in the ideal republic, one of the first actions should be to drive out all the actors from the city. Plato and many that came after him feared that the depictions of antisocial acts and immoral behavior in art were socially dangerous because they activated our baser, more primal instincts and emotions, rather than appealing to our higher faculties of analysis and reasoning. But you could argue that, to bring it to more recent, Freud himself sides with the king and Aristotle. One of his basic concepts was the return of the repressed, in which he believed psychosexual traumas and conflicts experienced both in childhood and as adults are never fully resolved. Yet, if left unrecognized or untreated, such problems are bound to fester and return as neurotic symptoms, behaviors, and phobias. Think of old and evil houses with monsters inside of them. Or maybe the most obvious example, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Before I go further, I want to preface. I offer my opinion on this question of why we love horror movies from a Western perspective. And that matters when discussing horror movies as a whole, because culture is an enormous a part of the genre film, and especially their inhabitants. It's a great article in The Atlantic I'll link below, but it says that each culture has its own superhero monsters. The chupacabra from South America, the Loch Ness Monster, the yokai, supernatural monsters from Japanese folklore, Alps from German nightmare creatures. But they all have a number of characteristics in common, too. Monsters are defying the general laws of nature in some way. They have either returned from the afterlife, like ghosts, demons, spirits, or they're some kind of non-human or semi-human creature. This speaks to the fact that things that violate the laws of nature are terrifying. Another aspect, I think, of why we love horror. And really, anything that doesn't make sense or causes us some sort of dissonance, whether it's cognitive or aesthetic, is going to be scary. Think axe-wielding animals, masked faces, contorted bodies. And in my take, in modern Western horror, Gothic literature from the days before, during, and after Edgar Allan Poe have paved the way to the formulaic horror film you find yourself exposed to so often here in the States. For example, the Japanese horror movie doesn't concern itself with decaying Victorian mansions. It doesn't resonate. But I'm not going to touch on horror history or differences, only enough here to show where my perspective follows. Horror, you see, is unique to each person's experience. Another reason I believe it has the staying power that it does and has existed since the dawn of man. Another quote is in order. I love quotes, if it isn't obvious by now. But this one's by literary critic R.H.W. Dillard. He says, "I suppose that all significant Western art, at least since the medieval period, has been directly concerned with the original fall of man and the consequent introduction of sin and death into the world. The horror film, at its best, as thoroughly and richly involved with the dark truths of sin and death as any art form has ever been. But its approach is that of a parable and metaphor, an approach which enables it to achieve a metaphysical grandeur, but which also may explain why its failures are so very awful and indefensible. Now, this quote could carry us one of two places. How bad a horror movie can really be, and oh boy, they can be. But we're going to take the other path, the fall of man, and a parabolic approach to this subject that horror movies take. I think the seriousness that horror takes the metaphysical and the supernatural is another reason we love the genre so much. Horror takes the supernatural in earnest, truly looking at not only what lies beneath, but what lies after. Death is the great equalizer, and the even greater do not discusser in our culture. We are all racing to this fate, and even if we don't like to talk about it, we're all hyper aware. It's coming. Horror not only addresses this unabashedly, mind you, but with honesty and sorrow and suffering and everything else that comes with it. But it's the metaphorical approach, I believe, that allows us to view it. Otherwise, I don't think we could. In my opinion, and maybe the most important story that gives the answer I found to our original question, is the story of Perseus and Medusa. The ancient Greeks had horror films figured out long before the first reel spun. See, no one could kill Medusa, and their fates were displayed to Perseus as he approached her cave and saw so many warriors surrounding him, stoned. Well, they were stoned, literally. So Perseus approaches her, walking backwards, using his shield's reflective surface to look at Medusa, and able to then use his scythe to decapitate her. I think the power of this story in relation to our question of our love for horror cinema lies in the fact he was able to look onto the horror that was Medusa and her terrifying snake updo. And because of the barrier that was his shield and its surface, and because he didn't look directly at her, he didn't meet the fate of so many before him. See, art, to go higher level, is our shield. It allows us to face horror indirectly, to look into the eyes even, without fear of turning to stone. And I believe the essence of that story is a fundamental reason for our love for horror movies. We can view the scariest things life has to offer in a metaphorical way, from evil manifest into Michael Myers from John Carpenter's Halloween, to the chaotic calamity of the universe in the mist, where the people are scarier than any cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft, or when grief and trauma suffocate and destroy like in Hereditary, or maybe even the most horrific fate of all. Through the eyes of a Puritan family in Robert Eggers' The Witch, we see the loss of a child. But I don't think the shield metaphor stops at, well, metaphors. I think our screen is the shield's reflection as well. Horror is visceral and honest. It shies away from nothing. And during its grasp, you're forced to reckon with such evil, pain, and suffering, all of which is such a large part of what it means to be human. It won't go away if ignored, and horror knows that more than any other genre. With our shield, we are able to face the monsters we fear the most without being in mortal danger. There's a reason horror has been with mankind since the beginning. Whether the Book of Revelations, the ancient Greeks, or in 1896, Le Manoir du Diable, released in the U.S. as The Haunted Castle, regarded as the first ever horror movie. Horror, it stokes something outside of ourselves, but is deeply woven into all of our existence, regardless of when that was. Horror isn't constrained by time. Absolute truths aren't. A square can never be a circle, and with light comes shadows. But maybe the calamity of life is also its beauty. The fact that it ends makes us clutch it more dearly. Beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them. And each mind perceives a different beauty. One person may even perceive deformity, where another is sensible of beauty. And every individual ought to acquiesce his own sentiment without pretending to regulate those of others. Maybe Hume explained best centuries ago why some of us find home in the darkness of the horror film. To so many of us, it's beautiful. When we look into the void on the backs of our shields and we stand face to face with a darkness nearly unimaginable, afterwards we hug people a little bit tighter. We appreciate the light, the absence of what we just saw and went through. But even so, I challenge you to get alone, cut the lights, and try to watch Hereditary, or The Exorcist, or The Shining. See that hesitation right there? It's just me saying that's why we love horror movies. What other genre can do that? But to add true horror, why this genre is timeless, and someone will one day make a holographic video answering the same question 100 years from now from a colony on Mars, it's because we could be Jack Torrance